I was 26 years old the morning Counselor Reth handed me a sealed case and told me not to open it until he said so. I remember the weight of it, not heavy, lighter than I expected for something that turned out to matter as much as it did. A hard-shell transit case, roughly the dimensions of a document folio, locked with a 3-digit manual tumbler in the old Earth commercial style. Reth carried it himself through the Vauren docking concourse, past the identity checkpoints, past the 6-man honor escort that the Dominion's Protocol Bureau had sent to receive us. Not as a courtesy, I would later understand, but as a form of enclosure. The kind of escort that makes clear you are being brought somewhere, not welcomed. Reth did not acknowledge them. He walked at his own pace, the case under his arm, and I walked one step behind him as a junior envoy was expected to do. I had been on his staff for 14 months. This was my 3rd interstellar assignment, and the first time I had been inside Dominion-administered space. I should say something about what the Dominion was, for anyone who wasn't paying attention to galactic politics in those years. The Vauren Dominion was not the largest polity humanity had ever encountered. That distinction belonged to the Aresi continuance, which stretched across something like 12% of the explored volume. But it was the most structurally coherent. It had been a functioning hegemonic Senate for roughly 400 years by the time we first made contact. It had a legal code, a transit infrastructure, a currency system, and an institutional memory long enough that its senior senators had great-grandparents who had also been senators. The Vauren were not, as a species, what you would call warmly inclined toward new arrivals. They were precise and procedural, and they had a strong preference for arrangements that they had designed. Arrangements that had evolved without their input were, in the Vauren administrative vocabulary, irregular. The word carried the same weight a human lawyer might give to the word actionable. Earth had been, for 31 years, deeply irregular. I did not fully grasp the dimensions of this until I sat down in the anteroom of the Vauren Imperial Senate's 3rd orbital chamber and read the formal charge document that had been delivered to the Terrestrial Diplomatic Bureau 6 weeks earlier. The charge was long, 14 pages in the formal Vauren administrative script, which our translation bureau had rendered into 41 pages of dense English because Vauren legal language compresses the way a hydraulic press compresses, and the translation software had learned, over decades of painful experience, to expand rather than condense. The summary, stripped of its procedural scaffolding, was this. Earth had been operating maintenance and repair activity inside a network of transit corridors, claimed by the Vauren Dominion, specifically the Sethran Corridor Complex, for an uninterrupted period of 31 years, doing so, without formal authorization, in a manner that constituted an unauthorized presence under Article 7 of the Vauren Terrestrial Proximity Agreement, and in doing so had accrued significant liability under the same treaty's penalty provisions. The Dominion was prepared to offer a corrective framework, a renegotiated access regime, under which Earth would formally acknowledge the unauthorized presence, accept a reduced set of transit rights subject to Vauren approval and review, and vacate the maintenance infrastructure it had installed within 30 standard months. The document did not say thank you for keeping our corridors running for 31 years. It did not say that because the Dominion did not know that was what we had been doing. That is the part I need to explain, because it is the part that made the morning in the Senate chamber what it became. The Sethran Corridor Complex was a network of 17 stable transit corridors in the outer arm of Vauren-claimed space. The corridors had been mapped by Vauren survey teams roughly 200 years before Earth developed a faster-than-light transit. The Vauren had used them extensively for about 80 years. Then, a combination of political reorganization and an eastward expansion of their core territory had shifted their primary trade routes inward, and the Sethran network had become a backwater. Secondary routes, low traffic, maintained on a minimal schedule. When Earth began exploring that region, which we had reached from a different vector than the Vauren, coming in from the galactic south rather than the east. We found 17 transit corridors in moderate degradation and a scattered set of Vauren navigational beacons that had not been serviced in decades. This was, I want to be precise, not an accident or an oversight or a gray area. Earth's Corridor Survey Bureau had flagged the Vauren claim markers. They were in our charts. What the Survey Bureau had also flagged was something the Vauren did not seem to have noticed. The Sethran corridors, despite their secondary status in Vauren route planning, were load-bearing for the entire eastern half of the Dominion's commercial transit grid. Not because traffic ran through them in large volume. It didn't. But because they were gravitational stabilizers for a cluster of higher traffic corridors further in. The Sethran network was, in the language of corridor engineering, a keystone complex. You could ignore it and use other routes, as the Vauren had been doing. But the other routes were slowly, almost imperceptibly, becoming less stable. The drift was measured in fractions per decade. It would take a long time to become a problem anyone could see in their daily operations. But the math was not ambiguous. Earth Survey Bureau had run the projections. They had also found, buried in the Vauren Terrestrial Proximity Agreement, a treaty that the Vauren had written largely themselves and that Earth had signed in our first decade of contact when we were still learning the legal idiom, a subclause under the Infrastructure Cooperation Provisions. Article 11, Section 4, Paragraph 3, which authorized any signatory to conduct maintenance activity within the other party's claimed corridor infrastructure when that infrastructure posed a stability risk to shared transit space, provided the activity was logged and reported through the treaty's Joint Technical Commission. The Joint Technical Commission had not convened in 19 years. By the time the Survey Bureau found the subclause, the Vauren representatives to it had been rotated out and not replaced. The commission existed on paper. Earth filed its maintenance logs through the commission's registered address anyway, every quarter for 31 years. The Vauren, as best anyone could tell, had never read them. This was the structure that Reth understood, and that the Dominion was about to discover it had been living inside. I understood the outline. What I did not yet understand, what I would not fully understand until the session began, was the invoice. Reth had not mentioned the invoice to me. He had not mentioned it in the 3 weeks of preparation before we departed. He had not mentioned it during the 14-hour transit to Vauren orbital space. He had not mentioned it in the anteroom, where he read through his own copy of the charge document with the steady, unhurried attention of a man reading something he has already read many times, occasionally making a small pencil mark in the margin that I could not interpret. He was 63 years old. He had been a working diplomat for 38 of those years. He had negotiated with 4 different galactic polities, signed 3 treaties that were still in force, and been formally censured twice by councils that had later, in both cases, found themselves substantially worse off for having done so. He was not a large man physically. Medium height, gray at the temples, a slight stoop from decades of desk work that made him look, at rest, like someone's retired accountant. He wore the standard terrestrial diplomatic uniform, dark coat, silver collar pin, no insignia beyond his service rank. He did not carry himself with the performed gravitas that some senior diplomats affected, the studied weight of the very serious person. He was simply, in every visible way, unhurried. I asked him, in the anteroom, whether there was anything specific I should be prepared to do. He thought about this for a moment in the manner of someone giving a genuine answer rather than a reflexive one. "When I ask you to open the case," he said, "open it. Take out what's inside and set it on the table in front of me. Then sit down." I waited for the rest of the instructions. There were no other instructions. I had been on staff long enough to know not to push him further. Reth's economy of instruction was not rudeness or dismissiveness. It was a form of professional discipline. He told you what you needed to know, no more, on the theory that excess information was its own kind of noise and that a junior envoy who understood their precise role would execute it. better than one who had been given a full briefing and was now managing a head full of strategy instead of paying attention to the room. So I sat with the case on my knee and waited. The Vauren Imperial Senate's third orbital chamber was not the largest deliberative space I had ever been inside, but it had a quality that larger spaces sometimes lack. It was built to make a point. The chamber occupied a full orbital ring of the station, with the seating tiers curving up and inward along the full circumference, so that wherever you sat, you were surrounded. The floor of the chamber, the speaking floor, where the parties under consideration stood, was a broad oval of pale gray stone, shot through with the dark blue mineral that appeared in formal Vauren architecture, the way marble appears in old Earth civic buildings. Above the floor, the station's outer shell was transparent. The orbital body below, a large moon, cloud-banded, turning slowly, filled the lower half of the window. The stars were visible in the upper half. It was a beautiful room. It was designed to be. It was also designed so that anyone standing on the speaking floor understood, at a cellular level, how many people were looking at them, and from how many directions. There were perhaps 300 senators in attendance. Not a full session. The third chamber handled treaty compliance and was considered administrative rather than political. But 300 was not a small number. The Vauren senators wore their formal Senate robes, deep gray, with the territorial stripe in the color appropriate to their home system. Some of the older ones had the elongated cranial ridge that Vauren elders developed with age, a feature that gave them, in profile, a look of permanent and considered severity. They sat in their curved tiers and they watched us walk in. There is a feeling that comes with walking into a room where everyone is watching you, and everyone in the room is the opposition. I do not think it ever fully normalizes, regardless of training. What training does is give you a set of responses to draw on rather than the one response your body defaults to, which is some variant of alarm. I had been through the Bureau's standard preparation courses. I knew the correct posture, the correct pace, the correct use of stillness as a tool. I knew these things intellectually. Standing on the pale gray stone floor of the third orbital chamber, with 300 pairs of Vauren eyes in the tiers above me, I was learning what it meant to use them under actual conditions. I kept my face still and followed Reth to the speaker's position. Reth walked to the speaker's position with the same pace he had maintained through the docking concourse, through the escort, through the anteroom. He reached the speaker's position, turned to face the chamber, and stood with his hands clasped in front of him, looking neither at the floor nor at any particular point in the tiers, but at some neutral middle distance that took in the whole room without fixing on any part of it. I took the secondary position beside and behind him, the case still under my arm, and I stood and waited. The presiding officer of the session was a senator named Torval Ashmaroon, who held the title of Audit Commissioner for this proceeding. Audit Commissioner was a Vauren designation that translated in our legal vocabulary to something between an administrative judge and a prosecuting chair. Ashmaroon was elderly, with the full cranial ridge and the slow, deliberate movements of someone who had spent many decades in formal settings and had long since stopped hurrying for anyone. He read the charge document into the record, all 41 pages of it in the original Vauren administrative compression, which in spoken form lasted approximately 22 minutes. The translation feed in my earpiece kept pace. I stood and listened and kept my face still. Reth stood with his hands clasped and listened with the same composed attention he had given the document in the anteroom. I watched him for a moment during Ashmaroon's reading, and I saw nothing in his posture or expression that indicated anything other than patient attention. Not boredom, not calculation, not any of the performed attitudes that politicians in some cultures adopt during long procedural recitations. He was simply listening. It was one of the most controlled pieces of professional composure I had seen, and I had been watching professional composure since I was 19 years old. When Ashmaroon finished reading the charge, He looked at Reth and spoke the formal invitation for Earth's representative to respond. Reth said, "Before the terrestrial delegation offers its response, we would like to enter a document into the record." Ash Maroon indicated permission. Reth turned to me. I opened the case. Inside, nested in fitted foam, was a bound ledger. Not a data device. Not a certified data crystal of the kind that was standard for formal Vauren record keeping. A physical bound ledger, printed on the high durability material that Earth's technical bureaus used for field documentation in environments where data storage was unreliable. The cover was plain, embossed with the Earth Corridor Survey Bureau's mark and the filing reference for the Sethran Corridor Complex Maintenance Program. The spine was thick. 31 years of quarterly maintenance logs, material cost records, labor allocation records, corridor stability measurements, and the accumulated total of an invoice that the Joint Technical Commission had never processed because no one had staffed it. I placed it on the table. Reth picked it up, opened it to the final summary page, and read one line. He read it in Vauren administrative speech, which he spoke without an earpiece or a translation assist. The figure, the total outstanding invoice for 31 years of maintenance work performed by Earth on Vauren-claimed corridor infrastructure. Under the authorization of Article 11, Section 4, Paragraph 3 of the Vauren Terrestrial Proximity Agreement, was a large number. I had seen it in the preparation documents. It was denominated in Vauren commercial currency, the standard unit for treaty-governed infrastructure work, and it was large enough that even translated into other scales of value, it took a moment to process. He read the number. Then he closed the ledger and set it on the table with the same unhurried precision he had used in setting everything. In his life down, the chamber was quiet. I want to be careful about what I say happened next, because I have told this story several times, and I have noticed a tendency in myself, when telling it, to describe the reaction as larger than it was in any visible way. The Vauren are not, as I said, a species that expresses distress through visible behavior. They do not shout. They do not rise from their seats in visible alarm. What happened was more like the change in air pressure before a storm. Something that wasn't visible so much as felt. A quality of stillness becoming a different quality of stillness. A room that had been waiting for a proceeding to unfold, discovering that the proceeding was not what it had expected to be. Ash Maroon was still for a long moment. Then he said, "Will the terrestrial delegation explain the nature of this document?" Reth said, "It is a maintenance invoice." Another silence. I noticed that in the nearest tier, 3 senators had turned to each other in the low, controlled way that Vauren senators confer when they do not want to be observed conferring. I noticed that at the bench beside Ash Maroon, one of the sub-commissioners had placed his hands flat on the bench surface in front of him, a gesture I did not know, but that looked like a man steadying himself. "The terrestrial delegation will clarify," Ash Maroon said, "the basis for this claim." Article 11, Section 4, Paragraph 3, Reth said, "The maintenance logs were filed quarterly through the Joint Technical Commission, beginning in the 2nd year of the program. The Commission's registered address is on file with the Treaty Bureau. The filing records are included in the appendix." He paused for exactly one breath. "The invoice is outstanding. I had been watching the senators in the nearest tiers. The reaction was not visible in the way a human crowd's reaction would be visible. It was visible in the way that very precise machinery shows stress, not in noise or movement, but in a kind of imperceptible tightening of all the tolerances at once. 3 senators in the 2nd tier had turned to confer with the colleagues beside them in low voices. 2 more in the 4th tier were doing something with their personal data devices that had not been happening before. Ash Maroon had not moved, but the quality of his stillness had changed. He had the look of a man running a very fast calculation that he had not expected to have to run, and running it fast because the result, when it arrived, would determine what he said next. And he needed the result before he opened his mouth again. "This commission," Ash Maroon said, "was not aware of this maintenance program. The Joint Technical Commission was notified quarterly. Reth said. The program has been active for 31 years. The invoice covers the full period. He picked up the ledger from the table, turned to the appendix section, and set it open in front of the table's recording surface so that the chamber's documentation system would capture it. We are happy to provide the commission with digital copies. We assumed, given the length of time involved, that you might prefer to begin with the physical record. The phrase, "we assumed," was doing a great deal of work. What it meant, without saying so, was this. We assumed you had been reading the quarterly filings. We assumed the Joint Technical Commission, though unstaffed in practice, was processing the documentation we were sending to it. We assumed that 31 years of maintenance logs, filed in full compliance with the treaty sub-clause you wrote, were reaching someone who was aware of them. We assumed that the Vauren Dominion, a 400-year-old hegemonic state with a legal code and an institutional memory and several hundred active senators, had not simply allowed its own treaty commission to go dark without notice and then filed a compliance charge against the party that had been faithfully submitting documentation to that dark address for 3 decades. None of that was said. It didn't need to be. The arithmetic was doing the talking. Ash Maroon turned to consult in a low voice with the 2 sub-commissioners seated beside him. This exchange lasted approximately 4 minutes, which is a long time for a formal Senate proceeding to simply pause. The chamber remained quiet during this. No one in the tiers spoke aloud. The silence was the kind that accumulates weight as it continues. The kind where you become aware, as each moment passes, that everyone in the room is having the same realization at slightly different speeds, and the process of that realization propagating through 300 intelligent people is audible, somehow, even though no one is making a sound. I kept my hands still and my face even, and watched the moon turning below the transparent floor. Reth stood with his hands clasped, looking at a point in the middle distance, as if he were waiting for a transit connection, and had brought enough patience to wait as long as required. I thought about the corridors. This is something I had not done in any serious way during the preparation phase. I had read the technical files, the stability projections, the maintenance logs, the engineering assessments, but I had read them as a diplomat reads supporting documentation, as context for an argument, as numbers that would become relevant at specific moments in a negotiation. I had not, until that morning, stood in the full physical reality of what we were discussing and actually thought about what it meant. The Sethran Corridor Complex was 17 transit corridors threading through a volume of space roughly the size of a small star cluster. Human engineering teams had been working in those corridors for 31 years. Not continuously. The standard maintenance schedule required a team on site for roughly 6 to 8 weeks per year per corridor, rotating through the network. But those teams had been out there, in that remote section of Vauren-claimed space, generation after generation of them. Some of the engineers on the current rotation had joined the program in their 20s and were now in their 50s, servicing gravitational stabilizers and navigational beacon arrays and corridor integrity membranes in facilities that bore the Vauren Dominion's survey markers and not a single sign of Vauren presence. They had filed their quarterly reports to an address that no one had answered. They had done the work anyway. I tried to imagine what it would be like to be one of those engineers. To go out, rotation after rotation, to a place that no one in the wider institutional universe seemed to know you were going to, and do precise, technically demanding, physically isolating work in deep space for reasons that were clear to the engineers and the Survey Bureau, and apparently to no one in the Dominion, whose infrastructure depended on it. To file reports into a void, to watch the stability numbers improve quarter by quarter and know that the improvement was because of you, even though no acknowledgement ever came. There was something in that image that felt like a specifically human patience. The patience of people who do the work because the work needs doing, and who do not require a witness. I also thought about the eastern half of the Vauren Dominion's commercial transit grid. which we were currently sitting inside, and about what the stability projections would have looked like if those engineers had not been out there. The numbers in the appendix were clear. 3 major transit corridors in the inner network would have shown measurable degradation within 15 years. 2 of them were primary arteries for the Dominion's agricultural trade routes, the ones that moved food from the outer agricultural systems to the core worlds. The degradation would have been gradual enough that the Vauren engineers would have spent years troubleshooting the symptoms before tracing the cause back to the Sethran keystone problem. By the time they identified it, the deterioration would have been significant. The cost of emergency remediation against a background of transit disruption and supply uncertainty would have been several orders of magnitude larger than the maintenance invoice Reth had just placed on the table. The invoice was denominated in infrastructure service units. The equivalent, if you wanted to think about it differently, was the cost of keeping several billion Vauren from a food supply disruption they would never have been able to trace to its source. We had not done this as a favor. The Survey Bureau had acted under the treaty subclause because the treaty subclause authorized the work, and because the work was necessary, and because the Survey Bureau was staffed by the kind of people who see a problem and solve it and file the paperwork correctly and do not wait for someone to tell them the problem is worth solving. The invoice was a legitimate invoice. The same invoice any infrastructure contractor would present for 31 years of authorized service. But the invoice was also for the Vauren Senate this morning, a mirror. It was showing them a reflection they had not expected to see, a record of sustained, competent, methodical work conducted inside their own infrastructure, under a treaty mechanism they had written and abandoned, by a species they had been in the process of formally sanctioning for being there. Ashmaroon ended his consultation with the sub-commissioners. He returned his attention to Reth. The commission requires time to review this document and to verify the filed records, he said. Of course, Reth said. This session will be suspended pending that review. The terrestrial delegation is invited to remain in residence at the diplomatic facility until the commission has completed its assessment. We will remain, Reth said. And that was, for that morning, the end of it. The session was formally suspended. The senators in the tiers began to move, in the controlled, unhurried Vauren manner, toward the chamber exits. Ashmaroon and the sub-commissioners remained at their bench and were already in a low consultation with a half-dozen administrative staff who had appeared from somewhere behind the bench as if summoned by the silence. On the speaking floor, Reth picked up the ledger, tucked it back under his arm, not placing it back in the case I noticed, leaving it visible, accessible, present, and turned toward the chamber's exit without haste. I fell into step behind him. We were in the corridor outside the chamber, moving toward the diplomatic facility before he spoke. You did well, he said. The timing on the case was exactly right. I just opened it when you asked me to, I said. That's the whole job sometimes, he said. I thought about this for a while as we walked. The review took 11 days. I occupied those 11 days the way junior envoys typically occupy waiting periods at foreign facilities. Reading, writing up field observations for the Bureau's record, running the daily physical maintenance that long transit and extended sedentary periods make necessary, and talking when opportunity permitted to people at the margins of the proceeding. Lower-level Vauren administrative staff, the facility's service personnel, the handful of other diplomatic observers who were present for adjacent proceedings and who had, inevitably, heard something about the suspension of our session. The diplomatic facility was a standard Vauren guest structure adjacent to the Senate station, comfortable in the functional institutional way that Vauren-administered spaces tended to be, precise in its geometry, unhurried in its rhythms, staffed by Vauren service personnel who were professional and correct, and who did not volunteer information but who did, in the ordinary course of facility operation, occasionally say things in the hearing of a junior envoy who was paying attention. I paid attention. I also spent significant time in the facility's reference library, which maintained an accessible archive of Vauren Senate proceedings and administrative records going back several centuries, and which was, presumably, available to guests as a courtesy that implied no risk because no guest had previously found anything in it that mattered. I read the records of the Joint Technical Commission. What the records showed, in the Vauren Senate's own archive, was a commission that had been actively staffed for the first 40 years of the Vauren Terrestrial Proximity Agreement's existence, had produced a substantial body of technical work in that period, and had then been quietly deprioritized during a Senate administrative reorganization that had reassigned its staff to other commissions, and had formally noted that the commission's functions were to be maintained pending future staffing review. The future staffing review had not occurred. The commission's registered address had continued to exist in the Treaty Bureau's official record because no one had closed it, and because Vauren administrative procedure did not automatically sunset registered addresses without an affirmative closure act. The quarterly filings from Earth Survey Bureau had been arriving at that address in the Treaty Bureau's intake system for 31 years, routing to a queue that no one was monitoring. There were 31 years of filings in that queue. I did the arithmetic. 124 quarterly reports, each one correctly formatted, each one bearing the proper treaty reference and the proper commission address, each one containing the maintenance activity summary, the stability measurements, and the updated invoice balance. The queue was full. The queue had been full for decades. The queue was, in the Vauren administrative system, technically closed, in the sense that the commission was technically active, which meant no alert had ever been generated about unprocessed incoming documents, because unprocessed incoming documents to an active commission were not, in the system's logic, an error condition. They were simply documents waiting to be processed. No one had processed them. No one had, apparently, looked at the queue in 19 years. What I learned from this, sitting in the Vauren Senate's reference library on the 7th day of 11, was something I have thought about many times since. A system can fail invisibly, at scale for an extended period, without any individual part of the system necessarily doing anything wrong. The Vauren staff who had been reassigned were assigned to work that needed doing. The administrators who had noted pending future staffing review had noted it correctly. The Treaty Bureau's intake system had processed the incoming documents correctly, routing them to their designated queue. The queue had accepted them correctly. No error had occurred at any visible seam, and yet the net effect was 31 years of maintenance logs sitting unread in an administrative void while the infrastructure they documented was kept functional by the party responsible for the situation in the first place. The clockwork had run precisely. No gear had failed. The result was stillness. I should be honest about what I was doing in those 11 days, because it was not only reading and writing and listening in corridors, and because the other thing I was doing turned out to matter. On the third day, I went to the facility's reference library and asked the librarian, a young Vauren staff member who was professionally helpful in the way that junior institutional staff learn to be when a situation is above their authority, whether the library maintained accessible records of the Senate's Treaty Commission proceedings. He said it did. I asked whether those records were available to guests. He said they were. I spent most of the next 4 days in the library. What I was looking for was the Joint Technical Commission's own record, its proceedings, its staffing history, its administrative correspondence. Not because I expected to find anything that would change the legal situation, which was already clear, but because I wanted to understand what had actually happened. Not what could be argued about what had happened. What had happened. The Commission's records were in a section of the archive that had not been accessed by an outside researcher in, as far as the library's own notation indicated, 11 years. The records themselves went back further. I read from the beginning. the Commission's inaugural session, the first technical working group meetings, the early correspondence between Vauren and terrestrial technical staff on corridor engineering standards. In those early years, the Commission had been active and productive. There were detailed meeting notes, technical reports, a substantial body of joint engineering standards that had made interoperability between Vauren and terrestrial corridor infrastructure significantly more reliable. This was work that mattered. This was what the Commission had been built to do. Then came the reorganization. I found it in the administrative records for the relevant year. A Senate committee report recommending consolidation of several technical commissions into a single coordinating body. The Joint Technical Commission was listed in the appendix as one of several to be maintained pending future. Staffing review, not dissolved, not transferred, maintained. The language was careful. The way institutional language is careful when the people writing it expect someone else to follow up and do not want to be blamed if no one does. The follow-up had not come. Future staffing review had meant no staffing review. I found the first of Earth's quarterly filings in the Commission's intake record. A document that had arrived at the registered address, been logged as received, and then routed to the Commission's processing queue where it sat. I found the second filing, and the third, and the first year's worth of them sitting in the queue in correct date order. After the first few years, the intake log became part of the background of the archive, a regular notation of received documents that no one was processing, like the record of a mail slot that continues to receive letters for a tenant who moved away without leaving a forwarding address. The slot is still there. The letters are still arriving. Someone's name is still on the slot. 31 years of letters. I sat with this for a while. Not as a legal discovery. The legal situation was not helped by knowing the precise administrative mechanism by which the Commission had gone dark. The legal situation was already what it was. I sat with it because it seemed important to understand it accurately, to see the full shape of it without the distortion that comes from looking at a past event only through the lens of a present outcome. The people who had done the reorganization had not been negligent in any individual sense. The intake system had done what intake systems are supposed to do. The quarterly filings had been correctly addressed, correctly formatted, correctly received. The engineering teams had done correct work and filed correct reports. And the net result of all this correctness, operating in isolation from itself, had been 31 years of an unmonitored queue growing longer in an archive that no one was reading. I thought about systems for a long time in that library, in a way that is difficult to fully reproduce. I had studied systems in the Bureau's training, treaty systems, negotiating systems, the procedural systems of various galactic polities. I understood systems analytically, but there is a difference between understanding a system analytically and sitting in the physical record of a system that had worked and failed at the same time, in the same operation for 3 decades. The understanding that came from the second kind of encounter was different, heavier, somehow, more useful. What I learned from this, sitting in the Vauren Senate's reference library on the 7th day of 11, was something I have thought about many times since. A system can fail invisibly, at scale, for an extended period, without any individual part of the system necessarily doing anything wrong. The Vauren staff who had been reassigned were assigned to work that needed doing. The administrators who had noted pending future staffing review had noted it correctly. The Treaty Bureau's intake system had processed the incoming documents correctly, routing them to their designated queue. The queue had accepted them correctly. No error had occurred at any visible seam. And yet the net effect was 31 years of maintenance logs sitting unread in an administrative void, while the infrastructure they documented was kept functional by the party responsible for the situation in the first place. The clockwork had run precisely. No gear had failed. The result was stillness. The Vauren Senate had a legal team that was, by all accounts, exceptionally good. They were good at finding the mechanisms within their own treaty framework that could be used to reframe a situation, to limit liability, to redirect the terms of an engagement. They were now in the process of discovering that Article 11, Section 4, Paragraph 3 had been drafted by their own legal predecessors in language that was not ambiguous, for reasons that were entirely sound and that had been entirely forgotten in the administrative reorganization of the Technical Commission, some 2 decades earlier. The subclause was clear. The authorization was clear. The filing record, 31 years of quarterly reports sent to the Commission's registered address, all time-stamped, all bearing the perform reference, all logged in the Survey Bureau's own archive, was clear. The invoice was authorized under the same subclause, which specified that maintenance work conducted under Article 11 was billable at standard infrastructure service rates. The Vauren legal team was not finding a way around this. What they were finding, I gathered from the fragments that reached me through 11 days of corridor conversation and overheard exchanges, was the shape of what had happened. The commission had gone dark. The quarterly reports had gone unread for decades. The maintenance program had continued, and the corridor complex had been quietly, reliably, invisibly maintained by human engineering teams under a treaty provision that the Dominion had written and then forgotten. The legal team was not finding a loophole. They were finding the limits of finding a loophole, which is a different kind of finding, and a more uncomfortable one. On the 4th day, Reth and I were invited to a working session with Ash Maroon and 2 subcommissioners, conducted without the full Senate in attendance, in a smaller administrative chamber. This was not uncommon in Vauren procedural practice. The full formal session was for record and position. The actual work of resolution happened in smaller rooms. The chamber was spare. A long table, 6 seats, no gallery. The station's outer hull transparent on one side, the same cloud-banded moon visible through it. Ash Maroon asked, at this session, whether the terrestrial delegation had any particular position on the form of resolution it wished to pursue. Reth said that Earth's position was straightforward. The maintenance program had been conducted under valid treaty authorization. The invoice represented legitimate work, and the terrestrial delegation's preference was for the Dominion to acknowledge both of those facts in whatever form the Commission considered appropriate and to arrange settlement of the outstanding account. Ash Maroon was quiet for a moment. Then he asked whether Earth had any current intention to modify or discontinue the maintenance program. Reth thought about this, in the way he thought about things, taking the genuine time required. The engineering teams are scheduled for their next rotation in about 4 months, he said. The work is ongoing. Whether it continues under the current arrangement or under a new formalized arrangement or under some other structure, that's a conversation the terrestrial delegation is open to having. But the corridors need maintenance. That's not a negotiating position. That's an engineering fact. Ash Maroon said nothing to this for a long moment. The corridors need maintenance, he repeated, in the flat way someone repeats a sentence when they are testing whether it means what they think it means. Yes, Reth said. Another silence. By your teams, Ash Maroon said. Our teams have been doing it for 31 years, Reth said. They know the infrastructure well. There was something that happened in Ash Maroon's face at this point that was hard to characterize precisely. The Vauren do not display emotion in the ways humans do. The musculature is different. The social norms around expression are different. The baseline register of a Vauren senator in formal proceeding is one of controlled deliberateness that can be mistaken for stoniness. But I had been in enough cross-species diplomatic settings to read the subtler signals. And what I read in Ash Maroon's face in that moment was not anger or defensiveness or calculated neutrality. It was closer to the look of someone who has been handed a map of a room they thought they understood and discovered that the room is significantly larger than they believed. He had been in that room for decades, doing work he understood, navigating a political system he had spent his career inside, and the room had been larger the whole time. The room had contained, in its outer precincts, a maintenance program that had been keeping certain structural elements intact, filing its reports correctly to a door that no one was answering for longer than some of the junior senators in the tiers had been alive. The session lasted another hour. Nothing was formally resolved at it. That was normal. Formal resolutions in Vauren procedure required the full chamber and the full record. But the shape of what would be resolved had, by the end of it, become clear enough that the shape itself was a kind of resolution. The original charge, unauthorized presence under Article 7, was not going to proceed. The commission had what it needed to understand why it was not going to proceed. The conversation was now about what came next. On the 7th day, I wrote a letter to my parents. This was something I did on longer assignments. The transit time made real-time communication difficult, and there was a tradition in the Bureau's junior staff of keeping a running correspondence with family that was sent in batches when you were within range of a reliable relay. My parents were not diplomats. My father was a civil engineer. My mother ran a small technical documentation firm. Neither of them had any particular connection to galactic politics, but both of them were people who understood at a professional level what it meant to do a job correctly in the absence of acknowledgement. I told them about the ledger. I told them about the engineering teams and the 31 years and the quarterly filings to an address that no one had answered. I told them about the corridor stability numbers and the food supply projections and the invoice. I told them about sitting in the reference library and reading through the commission's archive and finding 31 years of correctly filed documents in an unmonitored queue. My father wrote back 11 days later, which was when his reply reached me, and said, "That's just maintenance. Somebody has to do it." Yes, I thought, when I read this, that's the whole thing. The formal resolution session was held on the 12th day. The chamber was fuller than the initial session had been. Word had moved through the Senate, in the way that significant administrative findings move through large deliberative institutions, not as announcement or gossip, but as a kind of institutional awareness, a change in the air, so that by the 12th day, there were perhaps twice as many senators present as there had been on the first morning. They were there because this was the kind of proceeding that acquired significance in the sitting, the kind that would be in the institutional record in a way that mattered. And Vauren senators were, whatever else one might say about them, serious about their institutional record. We walked in the same way we had walked in 12 days before. Same positions, same pace, same speaking floor. The pale gray stone was the same. The moon was the same. The quality of the watching from the tiers was different. There were more of them, and they had had 12 days to process what had been placed on the table. And the watching had the feel of a room that has arrived at a settled understanding and is now witnessing the formality of that understanding being made official. Ash Maroon read the commission's finding. The commission found that Earth's maintenance activity in the Sethran corridor complex had been conducted under valid treaty authorization, specifically Article 11, Section 4, Paragraph 3 of the Vauren Terrestrial Proximity Agreement. The Commission found that the quarterly filings had been submitted in correct form and had been received at the Commission's registered address. The Commission found that the failure of the Joint Technical Commission to function as a processing entity was an administrative failure on the Dominion's part, not a breach of obligation by Earth. The Commission found the invoice to be legitimate and due under the treaty's infrastructure, service provisions. The original charge, unauthorized presence under Article 7, was formally withdrawn. Ash Maroon then read the second section of the finding, which addressed the forward structure. The Joint Technical Commission was to be reconstituted with active staffing from both parties. The maintenance program was to continue under a formalized operational agreement, with Earth's engineering teams recognized as the authorized maintenance contractors for the Sethran corridor complex for a renewable 15-year term. The invoice was to be settled within 90 days. He read this with the same flat deliberateness with which he had read the original charge 12 days earlier. The chamber was quiet throughout. When he finished, he looked at Reth. Reth said, "The terrestrial delegation accepts the commission's finding." That was the whole of it. In the corridor, afterward, we were moving toward the transit facility, the assignment effectively complete. I asked Reth whether he had expected it to go this way. He was quiet for a moment. "I expected the finding to be correct," he said. "The math only went one direction." "When did you know about the invoice?" I asked. He thought about this. "About 8 months ago," he said. "When the charge document was first transmitted, the charge cited Article 7, unauthorized presence. I read Article 7, and then I read the surrounding articles because that's what you do. And Article 11, Section 4, Paragraph 3 was there, and the subclause was there. And then I asked the Survey Bureau whether there was a maintenance program in the Sethran corridors, and they sent me the program documentation, including the filing record. And the invoice? The invoice had been accumulating in the Commission's unread queue for 31 years, he said. The Survey Bureau's financial office generates an invoice automatically each quarter. They had been doing it since the second year of the program. No one had ever paid any of it. It was just there, waiting. "Did you know before the charge that the corridors were being maintained?" He shook his head slightly. "It was in the Survey Bureau's operational files, not something that crossed the diplomatic desk. There are a lot of things in the Survey Bureau's operational files that don't cross the diplomatic desk." I thought about this. The image of 31 years of invoices accumulating in an unread queue, precise and patient. Each one generated automatically, each one sitting in order after the last, waiting with the impersonal patience of a system that did not require anyone to notice it in order to continue functioning. "The engineers," I said, "did they know anyone would eventually use the filings?" Reth looked at me. "I don't think that was the point," he said. "We reached the transit facility. Our departure was in 4 hours. I sat down in the waiting area and looked out at the orbital body below, the same moon, still cloud-banded, still turning at its own pace. And I thought about what it meant to do work that no one was watching. I had come into the diplomatic service because I thought I understood what diplomacy was. I thought it was the management of relationships, the careful construction of agreements, the translation of incompatible interests into workable terms. I still think that's part of it. But sitting in the Vauren transit facility with 4 hours before departure and 12 days of something I was still processing behind me, I was beginning to understand that there was another layer underneath the visible work of diplomacy, a layer that looked less like negotiation and more like the thing my father meant when he said, "Somebody has to do it." The corridors had needed maintenance. The treaty had authorized it. The engineers had done it. The filings had been correct. The invoice had been generated and generated and generated, and no one had paid it. And then the Dominion had filed a charge of unauthorized presence. And Reth had opened the ledger. And the math had been what the math had been. It was not a dramatic story. It was not a story about cunning or leverage or the sudden revelation of hidden power. It was a story about a system that worked, that had kept working. Quarter by quarter, filing by filing, rotation by rotation, in a remote section of space that no one in the Dominion had looked at in 31 years. And about what happens when you finally show someone the record. The corridors were stable. The eastern grid was intact. Somewhere in the Sethran network, a rotating team of human engineers was doing the work they had been doing for 3 decades, in the same methodical manner, and would continue to do it under a formal agreement with active staffing and a paid invoice. The math would continue to go only one direction. I flew home thinking about my father's letter. That's just maintenance. Somebody has to do it. The 14-hour transit home passed in a kind of sustained quiet that I had not expected. I had come into the assignment with the low-grade alertness that precedes formal proceedings, the particular kind of readiness that is less like excitement and more like a held breath, a state of compressed preparation that extends from the Moment you accept the assignment until the moment the proceeding is finished and you are moving away from it. The held breath releases, and what fills the space where it had been is not relief exactly, but something more like the room tone of an ordinary day. Heard clearly for the first time in weeks, I read. I wrote up my field notes in full, which I had been keeping in fragmentary form during the 11 days, adding the retrospective context that you can only add once the outcome is known. I ate the transit ration that the facility had packaged for us. Correct, adequate, flavored in the Vauren institutional style that managed to be neither good nor bad, only precise. And I drank the coffee I had brought in a personal thermos from the diplomatic facility's kitchen, which had learned, over the decades of hosting terrestrial delegations, to stock a reasonable supply of ground coffee for guests who required it. Reth slept for most of the transit. This did not surprise me. He was 63 years old and had just finished an 11-day assignment at a foreign facility following a 14-hour inbound transit, and he had conducted himself throughout with a degree of sustained composure that, when I thought about it during the outbound transit, had the same quality as the engineering teams in the Sethran corridors. Not performed, not managed, just continuous. The composure of someone for whom composure was not an effort but a settled condition. The way a corridor that has been properly maintained is stable, not because it is being held stable, but because the underlying structure is sound. On the approach to Earth orbit, I opened my field notebook to a fresh page and wrote, "The most durable argument is the one that doesn't need to be made. The one that is already in the record, filed correctly, waiting." Then I added, after a moment, "The work does not require a witness. The record does." Then I closed the notebook and watched the planet come up through the viewport. It looked the way it always looked, coming back from a long assignment, ordinary, particular, irreducibly itself. The brown-green continents, the white cloud systems, the deep blue of the oceans catching the angle of the sun. Below that surface, and in the offices and bureaus and technical facilities spread across it, and in the orbital platforms above it, there were tens of thousands of people doing work that constituted, in aggregate, the accumulated competence that had made the morning in the third orbital chamber what it was. Engineers who had gone out to remote corridors for 31 years. Administrative staff who had generated and filed quarterly reports to an address that never answered. Financial clerks who had processed invoice after invoice into a system that no one was reading, because the system required it, and the invoices were legitimate, and the correct thing to do was to continue doing the correct thing, regardless of whether anyone was watching. None of them would know the charge had been withdrawn, the invoice settled, the access formalized. Some of them would hear eventually, as word worked its way through the relevant bureaus. Most of them would process this information and return to their work, because the work was what was in front of them, and the work didn't change based on what happened in a Senate chamber 12 transit hours away. The planet came up, and I was glad to see it. Not the gladness of relief exactly, but the particular gladness of return. The recognition that the thing you have been away from is still there, unchanged in its fundamentals, doing what it does regardless of whether you have been watching it. Reth retired 11 months later. There was a small internal function, the Bureau's scale of ceremony for departures of long-serving staff, and he gave a short speech that consisted mostly of practical advice about the value of reading full treaty texts rather than summaries, and about the importance of asking, when you received any charge document from any party, what the rest of the relevant treaty article actually said. Afterward, in the smaller gathering that followed, I asked him what he was going to do. He said he had a vegetable garden that had been neglected for about 15 years, and that he intended to see what could be done with it. I thought about the engineers in the Sethran corridors, the quarterly filings, the invoice queue. Maintenance, I said. He smiled, which was not something he did often in professional settings. Somebody has to, he said. I have thought about that morning in the Vauren Senate chamber a great many times in the years since. I was 44 years old by the time I was given my own senior appointment. And by then, the Sethran maintenance program had been running under the formalized agreement for long enough that it was simply an established feature of the Vauren terrestrial relationship. Unremarkable, routine, the kind of institutional arrangement that people cite in briefings without knowing its origin. The invoice was paid, the engineering teams rotated on schedule, the corridors were stable. None of that is the part I remember most clearly. What I remember most clearly is the ledger, the weight of it in the transit case, lighter than I expected, the sound of Reth placing it on the table, the one line he read, in Vauren administrative speech, into a chamber that had been prepared to spend the morning processing a compliance charge, and found itself instead processing a 31-year record of work that had been going on, correctly and continuously, since before some of those 300 senators had taken their seats. And then the silence that followed, which was the sound of a room doing arithmetic it had not expected to do, arriving at an answer that only went one direction, and understanding that they had, for 31 years, been living inside a structure that they had designed, and then stopped looking at, and that the structure had kept running anyway. The corridors had needed maintenance. Someone had been doing it. The invoice was outstanding. These were not complicated facts. They did not require argument or advocacy or the performance of any particular power. They required only that the record exist and that someone had kept it, and that someone else had read the full treaty before accepting the terms of a charge. I have been a working diplomat for a long time now. I have sat in a great many chambers and across a great many tables, and I have been party to negotiations that were loud and complicated, and that required every tool the Bureau's training provides. But the morning I learned the most about the work, about what it actually is and what it actually requires, was the morning I was 26 years old and I opened a transit case on instruction and put her on a table and sat down. The rest was already in the record. It had been there for 31 years.